Stephen Mitchell's perspective from my book, The Search for Being, Deviating from Family Patterns. Bursting the chains that enslave being often begins by deviating from familiar family patterns of interaction. Our most intense need, our most fundamental motivation, wrote psychoanalyst Stephen Mitchell, is our need for social relations. The conflict we contend with throughout our lives, he believed, is our struggle to maintain ties with others and the struggle to differentiate ourselves from them. We might maintain ties with others through psychological merger, by acting dependent, by being controlling, through domination, or in many other ways. How we maintain ties with others depends, Mitchell wrote, on how we learn to cope with relational situations in our early life. As youngsters growing up in our families, we learned patterns of interaction that stay with us the rest of our lives. We're drawn to people who recreate the emotional environment we knew as a child. By relating in ways that are familiar to us, we feel secure. We enter new relationships, structuring them on models of the old ways we've learned people connect with each other. So if you grew up in a home where mother was depressed because she was in a bad marriage to father, and your role was to try to make her happy and make up for all father didn't do, you may play that same role with others today. You might tune in to the sadness or unhappiness in others and relate to them in the same way you did with mother back then, trying to solve other people's problems, behaving as a caretaker. Besides patterns of relating we learned in childhood, our earliest emotional ties, Mitchell tells us, are also based on identification. One way we unconsciously connect with others is by identifying with the qualities they have, taking over the attitudes of the other. It is as if the other becomes a part of us. We might catch ourselves acting like our parents, reacting to things as they did. Or we might not be conscious of this. We may not be aware that part of our personality comes from mother or father or another significant other in our early life. Yet, identification leads to character traits that become stable parts of our personality. Mitchell believed identification is a major way we connect with others, and that our problems often rest with conflicting identifications. For instance, we may identify with father's strength, independence, joy of life, yet with mother's weakness, dependency, depression. What we need to do is uncover our motives for such identifications. What identifying with the dependency and depression of mother accomplishes for us. Why we identify with father's strength and independence. What are we defending against by identifying with mother's dependency? Isolation? What are we defending against by identifying with father's independence? Fear of fusion and loss of identity? It's as if acting like our parents acted keeps us connected to them. To be like family members keeps our connection to them strong. To act differently would be to abandon the security the connection to them once brought us. To relate in another way would be to put oneself outside the family and its typical way of connecting. Sometimes what we think we want as adults isn't what we really want, but rather unmetabolized identifications we have with our parents, Mitchell wrote. We acquire from them a particular characterological way of living, a way of interacting that feels like home. While we took care of our mother, we may have always argued with father. So the two interaction patterns we use as adults to relate are either taking care of people or arguing with them. If we try to deviate from these patterns, we might feel anxiety. If in later life we need help, have to play the part of the helpee rather than the helper, we might not be able to do it. We had to repress those parts of ourselves that didn't fit the role we played in our families. When we try to break out of these roles, we feel anxious. We enter into new relationships, structuring them on models of the old ways we've learned people connect with each other, Mitchell believed, and in so doing, maintain loyalty to the ways of our family at the expense of an infinite number of other ways of relating to others. Stephen Mitchell defined pathology as our inclination to repeat feeling, doing, and relating in the same old painful ways we knew as youngsters. The problem is our rigid patterns of relationship. No matter how many times the players change or new people come in and go, the script remains the same as we cast new people in our lives into roles that are familiar to us. We connect with others who complement these unconscious roles. If we need to feel valuable and important as we were made to feel back in childhood, we find people who have a need to idealize us in a relationship. Our relationship may thrive because it's based on complementary illusions. Understanding yourself begins by looking at your behavior in the context of the relationships you are functioning in, according to the relational model of Stephen Mitchell. By discerning interaction patterns, we can begin to change our lives and find new ways of being. We can reclaim parts of ourselves we may not have realized existed. Karen Horney called rigid patterns people fall into neurotic trends. Some of the patterns we might find ourselves enacting are submission. We might find ourselves always putting other people's needs ahead of our own, striving to win the other's approval, desirous of living up to their expectations, afraid if we assert ourselves, others might desert us. Another pattern centers around control, where we have to be the boss, wanting others to live by our standards. Detachment is a third interaction pattern, where we're unable to make commitments, running away rather than fighting for what we believe in. Maybe you grew up in a very poor family, where in consideration of your parents' plight, you never asked for anything, and you find you can't ask for anything of those whom you relate today. Maybe you grew up never able to depend on anyone, and even though there are people you could depend on today, you are still locked into that rigid interaction pattern. It's by looking at our past that we can gain insight into how we approach people today. The way we learn to connect with others as children is often the way we try to maintain connections today. It isn't easy to experience ourselves outside of what Mitchell called these pre-designed categories of yesterday. We have to ask ourselves why we value this way of relating so much today. What does it do for us? What would happen in our past if we didn't relate that way? What do we gain by relating this way today? What do we lose? It's not, Mitchell wrote, that any one pattern is wrong. The problem is that it might be the only way we can be. If we can only relate to others if they admire us, we're not relating to others in all their entirety, but just to a part of them, to the function they can provide for us. Once we start reflecting about such things, we may see that maintaining this pattern impoverishes us. We may realize how much of our autonomy we lose by relating to others through identities we learned in our families. We have to come to the realization we have choices, where once we related to others in only one way, we have to experiment with new ways of being. We need to discard limiting views of who it is possible for us to be in relation to others. Where once we were only a caretaker, we might need to allow ourselves to experience feelings of dependency. Where once we were just compliant, we may need to allow ourselves to be more assertive. How we choose to relate to others is up to us. We can continue the old family interactive patterns, or we can deviate from them. Each day, we decide again with every new person we meet. Constructive, creative living necessitates continual choice, Mitchell wrote. The things that make us anxious are the keys to those disowned parts of our personality that we don't allow ourselves to express. It might make us anxious to ask for help, because that wasn't the pattern by which we connected to our families. Any relationship will thus be fraught with anxieties, risks we must take, hard choices we make about self and others, Mitchell contended. From our own temperament and genetic endowment, our experiences of culture, of family, the circumstances we find ourselves in, we fashion our being. Being begins with a declaration of psychological freedom, with a greater awareness and increased sense of our own agency. It is we who structure our relationships with others. Our choice is between continuing patterns we learned in the past or deviating from them and experimenting with new ways of being in the present. The first step in deviating from family patterns is reflecting on our own behavior to discern our patterns. The second step is trying out new behaviors, new ways of being, to expand the range of our patterns.